Hi there, welcome to Boy Meets Quilt. I'm Andrew Vay Hansen. This video is going to be a bit of an experiment. I'm going to attempt to document the process of me making a quilt from beginning to end. I kind of did that with one of my previous videos. If you saw the one where I made my rooftop water towers quilt, I kind of did that with that quilt. I'm hoping to do it better this time. We'll see. As you can tell, if you watched any of my other videos, I am not a filmmaker. So we will see how this goes. Thanks for attempting to come on this journey with me. So the quilt I'm going to make is going to be for the Brooklyn Quilters Guild's upcoming fence show in April of 2022. And so if you've seen some of my previous videos, I've talked about the fence shows. The Guild has been doing these shows because we can't do our indoor shows that we normally do because of the pandemic. So the fence shows take place outside along the fence that surrounds our monthly meeting place. And they've been a great success. We've done 3 so far. This will be our 4th. And each fence show has a theme. So the theme for this fence show is recycling, repurposing materials. The Guild has really been focused on green initiatives the last few months, which is fantastic. As we all know, quilters and people who work with fabric, there's a lot of waste involved. And so we're trying to minimize that waste, and one of those ways of minimizing the waste is to reuse textiles in your home in an artful way, rather than just either throwing them away to be put into landfill or even giving to Goodwill or some secondhand store, which is all great, but there are a lot of statistics about how a lot of that ends up in landfill as well. So why not make it into art? One of the parameters that the people who came up with the theme this year, one of the parameters they came up with is that they would like our quilts to be made out of, at least 85% of the quilt to be made out of recycled materials. And specifically, they're not interested in quilting scraps. The quilting scraps are great. Hopefully you're saving those scraps and making them into fun, scrappy quilts or pillows or dog beds or whatever. That's all fantastic. But they would like us to get a little more creative and find textiles in our homes that you wouldn't necessarily associate with quilting and make those into a quilt. So the last couple of months, I've been digging around my apartment with old clothes, bed sheets, curtains, whatever I can find that I don't use, that I haven't used in years, that are probably either going to get given away or thrown away. And I've made a nice pile here, as you can see. I have more than enough material. The quilts are 36 by 36 inches, and so there's plenty of material here to make that size of a quilt. The tricky thing for me is that you can't really tell right now, but all of this stuff is completely different material, different textures, different fiber contents, and that's a challenge for me. I have generally only made quilts out of quilting cottons or batiks or those kinds of materials, maybe some silk here and there. I have made one t-shirt quilt, but that was completely made out of t-shirts. So all of that material worked together. This is going to be all different kinds of materials that don't necessarily work together, and we'll see how that goes. Because that's going to be the biggest challenge for me, trying to make these materials work together, I'm making my design, my overall quilt design, intentionally simple. So here's a sketch of the design that I'm gonna basically replicate. As you can see, it's basic strip piecing, just rectangular shapes of material pieced together into strips and then piecing the strips together. I'm not going to worry about lining up seams or saving points or all of those fun patterns that we come up with as quilters that are challenging but then look spectacular when they're all put together. Not going to worry about that. I'm just doing a very simple design so that what I can really focus on is making sure I'm able to successfully piece all of these different materials together. So let's take a look at some of these materials that I'm hoping to use. Here we have this beautiful cashmere sweater that my mom donated for the project. It has some holes in it. She doesn't wear it anymore. And so instead of giving it away, which I don't think she could even give it away because of the holes, so instead of throwing it away, it's going to be featured in my quilt. And look at that, these beautiful cable knits in the sweater. I'll definitely be featuring these beautiful designs. I'm very excited about this piece, but that's gonna at some point get pieced in with these denim jeans. I'm gonna try and use some of the features of a pair of jeans, such as back pockets, or even, you know, these flat felled seams that are how you put jeans together. And we'll see how knit cashmere and denim materials work together. My main goal for the quilt top is to find different design features in most of the materials I'm using, even things like just a button, a row of buttons in a shirt. We'll see how that works. I've got this pillow sham that I found. I forgot all about this. It's been in my closet for who knows how long, like well over a decade. And so it's beautiful, this beautiful blue printed pattern on the brown. So I will definitely be using this in the quilt. I have this nice heavy velvet curtain. Again, it's just been sitting in my closet for over a decade. So why not use it in the quilt? This beautiful velvet. And then it even has a lining, and I'm thinking this lining would be great for a binding. Although the cream might be too stark of a frame for what I'm looking for the quilt. We'll see. If I don't like it as a binding, I'll end up just using the material for facing the quilt, and then I won't even have a binding. So that'll be great, because my goal is to make my quilt out of 100% recycled materials. Everything except the thread. The thread will be first-time use thread, but everything else I'm hoping to do recycling, including the batting of the quilt. And so I have these old bamboo sheets that I don't use anymore. They're really stretchy, so I don't know how this is gonna work, but I'm hoping maybe a couple layers of this for the batting will work really well. We'll see. One of our guild members was recently featured in our monthly newsletter, and she made a quilt out of 100% recycled materials, and her batting was plastic bags. So I figure if she can use plastic bags for her batting, surely I can use an actual fiber material for my batting. So I'm hoping these bamboo sheets work well for that. So I think I have plenty of material for the top, the batting, and the back of the quilt, and the binding or the facing material, whatever I end up choosing. So I'm excited to start cutting the stuff up and piecing it together. And I'm excited for you to watch me go through this process, hopefully not too awkwardly, and we'll see how it goes. Okay, so I'm at my cutting table, which is basically my dining table that I have a cutting mat on. I have my rotary cutter and my big 8x24 ruler that I love. And I'm going to start with the jeans. I'm going to start with the jeans because I definitely want to include this pocket. And so this, once I cut this out, will kind of give me an idea of the overall size of the long strips that I want to make for the quilt. I showed that sketch earlier about how I was thinking about the quilt. That is just a very rough sketch. I may add some more strips. I may have different widths of each strip. We'll see. We'll see how it goes as I'm cutting the different fabrics and seeing how they come together. But I want to start with this pocket because I know I want this element in the quilt. The rest of the elements are going to have a little more leeway as far as width and narrowness. So we'll start here and we'll start cutting these jeans apart and seeing what I want to use in the quilt. Like I said, I'm going to start with my pair of jeans and I'm going to cut out this back pocket. I chose the pocket with the Levi's label because I liked that little detail, that little red tag there sewn into the pocket.
I think that's cool, and I want to keep that in the quilt. I started out using my ruler to help with the cutting. Um, and at this point, I'm just making some general cuts in just big pieces. This is not necessarily the size of the pieces that'll end up being in the quilt, but I just wanted to take everything apart and so that I could work with the material that I was planning on using in the quilt. We got that pillow sham there. We've got this shirt, some sweaters. As I was cutting things up, I realized that sometimes the back of the material was just as interesting as the front. So that's always something I recommend doing. Always look at the back of whatever fabric or material you're using, because sometimes it might have a nice muted color. If you're working with quilting cotton, that could work as a contrast with your piecing. And sometimes it has a really cool texture. And so now everything's cut up. Let's start putting it together.
All right, so we are here in the hallway of my apartment because this is the only wall long enough to have my design wall. So I've been doing a lot of cutting the last couple days, and I think I have the top cut out. So you can see most of it behind me, but I'm gonna flip the camera around so that you can take a better look at what I put together. Because my design wall is in a hallway, I always have to look at everything at an angle because I can never just get a full front view of it, although this is not too bad. But anyway, you can see I've been cutting out all my garments and fabrics that I've found throughout the apartment over the last couple months. Some of them I took a video of while I was cutting. Some I discovered in between that video and now. For instance, I cut up some old ties that my grandfather gave me that I don't know if this is the case, but it's very possible that my great-grandmother made those ties for him. There were no labels on the ties, and they were both made exactly the same way, and they're both pretty much the same material. I don't think it's even silk. I have a feeling it's like a polyester. It's pretty cheap material, but I think the patterns are really cool, and I've never actually worn them as ties, so this would be a great way to use something from my family, from my grandfather, that I can cherish forever in the form of a quilt. You can see that I've been trying to keep some details of the former fabrics, such as these seams from my jeans, some buttons. We'll see how some of this works. It's gonna be really thick fabric. When I cut up my sweaters, I tried to mix up the different knitting patterns, whether that was something like this ribbed knit that was around the waistband, and then of course this cable knit I put throughout the quilt because it's just so beautiful. But I also did some rib knit from that sweater. I turned one of my sweaters inside out because I really liked how the pearl stitch looked on the other side. You can see that here as well. So I just tried to mix it up a little bit, and while I was putting things together, my main concern was that there wasn't any matching fabric pieces right next to each other. And I'm pretty sure I was successful with that, and this I think is going to be as good as it gets. So now it's just a matter of piecing it all together. All right, so I'm back here at my sewing machine. I have my first strip of fabric from my design wall pulled down. I pulled it down in the order from top to bottom in the right alignment, so all I need to do is start piecing this pile together. What I plan on doing is I'm going to use a walking foot for my piecing. I found when I made my t-shirt quilt that with that thicker layers of fabric, because you had your knit t-shirt fabric plus the stabilizer underneath on both pieces, so it was like 4 layers of fabric, it just went much better. It's sewed much more smoothly if I used a walking foot for my piecing, which I normally don't do when I'm piecing just quilted cotton. And because all of these fabrics are so different, there are different thicknesses, there are different fiber content, I just decided walking foot would probably be best so that we have feed dogs on the bottom and the top, and hopefully no matter what the two pieces of fabric are that I'm piecing together, they will go through the machine at the same time smoothly. That's the idea. We'll see how that goes. I put a new needle in my machine because, again, some of these fabrics are going to be pretty thick, especially with my denim when I'm sewing over some of the seams. That's going to be a lot of thick fabric, so I wanted a nice sharp new needle in my machine. And I think I'm ready to go once I get this attached, and I will start piecing it all together. I'm going to go strip by strip, vertical strips, because that's how I imagine putting the quilt together, and we'll see how it goes.
And here we go, piecing stuff together. Now, when I first started piecing, I realized this tie material was so slippery that I needed to pin it whenever I was piecing it with another piece of fabric. I normally don't bother with pinning when I'm doing just basic piecing, like rectangles together. But in this case, the pins were absolutely necessary. Otherwise, the fabric just slipped all over the place. So that took a little bit more time to piece this all together than it normally would, but it was well worth that extra bit of time to make sure that everything was sewn together correctly. So we just zipped through this. Obviously, I don't sew as fast as this video is, but I didn't want you to have to sit through all of my sewing. So I cut it for time. This is one of the strips, probably the first strip for the quilt. And just getting all of these pieces sewn together. As you see, whenever I come across this tie fabric, I pin it to the next piece of fabric so that it doesn't slip around. And that is one of the 6 strips that I'll use for the quilt. Ta-da! So I've got my strips sewn together. I'm going to press my seams so that everything lies nice and flat. In this case, because the fabric's so bulky, I'm pressing my seams open. I always just make that decision depending on the pattern I'm using and the fabric that I'm using. And now that I have my 6 sets of strips pieced together, I am going to start piecing the strips to each other. So we'll just start off with the first 2. I've labeled each of my strips so that I know which direction to go from left to right as I'm piecing them together. I highly suggest labeling your pieces when you're making any sort of complex design. Even with this non-complex design, you just don't want to accidentally ruin your vision that you originally had by piecing the wrong strips together or piecing something upside down. So I always label everything. I just put little pieces of paper with either A, B, C, D, or 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever floats my boat that day, and it really helps me keep everything organized. And so, because this is a small quilt, it's all going together pretty well, and I'm not worrying. I don't really have to pin anything with this at this point because the strips were already pieced together, so that gave all of the fabric more stability than when I was just piecing the separate rectangles of fabric together originally. And now that it's all pieced, I'm going to take it over to the iron and once again press the seams open. And now it's time to pin baste my quilt. I baste my quilt the old-fashioned way. I tape down my backing. I put my batting on top of that. In with this case, it's 2 layers of bamboo sheets. And then I put my quilt top on top of that. And then I used curved safety pins to pin baste the whole thing together. It's a bit of a tedious process, but I just put on some good music and get into the zen of it. And before you know it, it's all put together, ready for quilting.
Hello there. So, as you saw earlier, I pin basted my quilt, so it's ready to be quilted. And it is now evening, hence kind of the horrible lighting right now, rather than the beautiful natural light I usually try to use. But I want to get started, at least on the quilting tonight, and so I want to get this video made. If you've watched other videos, you know I love free motion quilting. I find that's one of my favorite parts of making a quilt, is just that zen of coming up with doodle designs while you're quilting, and it's a really lovely process for me. However, I feel like trying to free motion this quilt the way I have this set up is beyond my skill set. I think more experienced, more talented free motion quilters could probably make it work. But like, I don't even know what my free motion foot would do with like a sweater material like this. I think it would get caught a lot, and it would just cause a lot of frustration. So I'm gonna stick with my walking foot. It's what I use to piece it all together. I'm gonna use it for quilting too, and I'm just going to do very basic walking foot quilting. I'm going to start off and I'm going to stabilize these long strip seams that I made, because these are all seams that are from top to bottom of the quilt. So that should be easy. There will be this section right here with my jean pocket where I'm just going to basically stop quilting here and start quilting again here, because this is going to be a mess, I feel like. And I'll just leave that unquilted right there. And then as far as the other direction, I think I will just pick some areas of the quilt where I can do a nice, clean, straight line clear across the quilt, and leave it at that. I'm not going to do matchstick quilting. I'm not going to do anything fancy with the walking foot quilting. I'm just going to do some basic stabilizing quilting and leave it at that. So the beauty of the quilt is just going to be the wonderful fabrics that I'm using, and the quilting, I kind of hope you don't even notice it. And so to that end, I picked out the thread color that I'll be using for my quilt, and I found this brown. I have several different shades of brown, but I feel like this particular shade does the best job of kind of disappearing in all of the fabrics, no matter what color they are. You know, you can see it a little bit in this lighter blue. You'll definitely be able to see it in the turquoise. But there's no one single thread color that would have disappeared in everything, because I have a variety of hues in this quilt top. But I feel like this brown is as close as I'm gonna get. So it's what I'm gonna stick with. And so I'm just gonna load up some bobbins and get this loaded up on my machine, put this under the needle, and then start quilting.
All right, time to quilt the quilt. Quilting is normally my favorite part of this whole process, especially when I'm free motion quilting. As I said before, I'm not free motion quilting this quilt. I'm just doing your basic walking foot quilting. I'm going to start by reinforcing the vertical seams that all are in one line from top to bottom. And then as I finish those up, I'll pick some certain points along the horizontal part of the quilt and do some straight walking foot quilting along there as well. It's not a terribly exciting process when you do it this way, but it's a nice look. It's a nice clean look, and I use this technique when I don't want the quilting to be the star of the show. In this case, I want my patchwork to be the star of the show. Once I've finished quilting the quilt, it's time to square it up. I use my largest square quilting ruler, and I just cut away from this one corner to the next corner. It's pretty easy. And it makes a perfectly square quilt. Look at that. The quilt is almost complete at this point. The last step is putting on the binding. So what I like to do for most of my quilts is I sew a binding to the front of the quilt, and then I will turn it over and hand sew it to the back. I use a 2.5-inch wide strip of fabric that I fold over, so I have a nice folded double layer binding to protect the edge of the quilt. And now for the final step of putting all of my quilt together is hand sewing the binding to the back of the quilt. I have done both machine binding and hand binding in the past with quilts. I tend to prefer the look of hand sewing the binding to the back of the quilt, but that's probably because I just need more practice with the machine binding. But for now, sticking with the hand binding.
All right, here it is, all finished. You've been going on this journey with me. This is a very long video compared to my other videos, but hopefully it's been worth it. I have the finished quilt right here behind me, and I'm really pleased with how it turned out. As I explained early on in the video, my whole design concept from the beginning was very simple, and I've kept it that way. The quilting is extremely minimal. I probably should have quilted it more, but you know, it's not going to be laundered. It's a wall hanging. It doesn't really need a lot of stabilization, and so I just kept the quilting to a minimum so that this patchwork of all these amazing textiles really shine through. So let's go through everything that I used to make this quilt. Other than the thread, everything that's part of this quilt is a repurposed textile. So we have a velvet curtain from my old apartment that no longer fits in any of the windows in this apartment. I have a pair of jeans and an old pillow sham that I didn't even realize I had until I was rummaging around in our linen closet. A couple of sweaters. One is my mom's sweater and one is my old sweater. They both had holes in them. They weren't things that you could donate because of the holes, and we weren't going to wear them anymore. A couple of ties that my grandfather gave me that I've never actually worn. They just weren't shaped the way I like my ties to be shaped. They were very dated and not in like a cool retro way, so at least not for me. So why not use them? And this way I have them that they're not just like back in the back of my closet anymore. They're actually part of a beautiful piece of art. And then I think, and then a pair of socks that had holes in the feet. So this is the top of the socks, and I thought it was a cool texture, cool color. And then this turquoise and this area with the buttons is a shirt that I made in a sewing class many years ago. It was a woman's blouse. I gave it to my mom. I don't think it, you know, in the sewing class, we just used the pattern that the instructor gave us, so it wasn't fit for anyone. I don't think it really fit my mom. She put it in the dress-up bin for the kids that she used to babysit, and so it was worn by like children at a certain point. But then my mom retired, and that was no longer something that people did, and so now I'm using it in a quilt. So that's the quilt top. The quilt back is made up of a cotton bed sheet that had holes in it, so I wasn't using it anymore. The batting in between the top and the back is made up of an old bamboo sheet, again, that had holes in it, so I wasn't using it anymore, and the bamboo was a little more stretchy and softer than the cotton sheet, and so I thought it might be making an interesting batting. I'm not sure I'll ever do that again. If I do use sheets as batting, I think I'll stick with maybe cotton sheets because they're a little more stable. The bamboo sheet was definitely, because of the stretchiness, I think it made the quilting a little more difficult. in addition to all these amazing different textures that I was dealing with already. So, you know, live and learn. And then the binding is made out of this blackout lining that was part of the old curtain that I cut up for the quilt top. So I really like how the binding really frames the quilt because it's such a stark contrast to the colors of the quilt. So that's that. I'm really pleased that I set out to make an almost 100% repurposed quilt, and I think I've succeeded. And which means I think anyone out there could do the same thing. And again, it can be very simple. I mean, if depending on the textiles you pick, you could make a really beautiful, complex quilt patterned top out of repurposed textiles if you wanted to. I would suggest using textiles that are more woven, like cottons and silks, versus knit materials like sweaters or socks, because the knit materials are just so stretchy, it's going to be really difficult to work. And some of like these sweaters, I'm not even sure like a stabilizer would work with the sweaters. That's what you use when you're working with t-shirt material. And it really helps so that you can piece things more easily. But I'm not even sure how you would iron on the stabilizer to like a sweater. I think the knit is too open compared to a t-shirt. But who knows, you could try it and let me know, see how it goes for you. But definitely, you know, denim, I see lots of beautiful denim quilts that are made from people's old jeans. You can really get some beautiful play with colors and how different parts of the jeans are worn out and have a different color than the other part of the jean. So that's really cool thing to play with. And yeah, and bed sheets, all sorts of things that you can use to repurpose into a beautiful quilt. And then after making this quilt, it is much softer and cozier than a normal quilt is. And usually with a brand new quilt, it's a little stiff because quilting cotton is a tighter weave than other kinds of cottons. And then the batting and the backing and all those, and then depending on how heavily you quilt it, it can be a pretty stiff blanket. And so you have to wash it several times before you get that cozy, quilty feeling that people love. However, this is really cozy and soft and pliable right away. And so it's a really fun idea to make a full like lap quilt or bed quilt out of this. It would be heavy, which I know a lot of people like that weighted blanket feel when they're sleeping or feeling some anxiety. And you could make it heavier by adding weights and stuff to it like you would with a weighted blanket. So yeah, I may explore that. The tricky thing, I'm sure part of what makes it so pliable right now is the sheets in the middle that I used for the batting, which again, I don't think I'll ever do again. But maybe cotton sheets would be easier to work with and still have that same comfy, cozy effect. So we'll see, you know, something to think about for the future. Once again, thank you for coming on this journey with me. I hope it was entertaining, if nothing else, maybe a little educational. It certainly was educational for me. I worked with materials I've never worked with before, and it came together pretty easily. I'm glad I stuck with a simple design, so that's a big tip out there. If you're working with something new, keep the design part basic so that you can just focus on the new stuff, which is what I did. I focused on just figuring out how to piece together all of these crazy different textures. And that's that. So join me for my next video whenever that one comes out, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you.